Hello, happy Sunday. It is the Sunday before Halloween, and it's been a crazy season. I hope you are all doing well. I hope there's some folks out there ready for ghost stories with spooky Ms. T.I. But if not, I will post this so you can watch later. I know Sunday nights are getting a little crazier. A lot of us are back at work. A lot of us were back at work and have been sent home again. This thing is not over. And if everybody does their part and follows the rules, follows the guidelines, follows the science, maybe we won't be in this state sometime in the hopefully near future, but hopefully we don't have this all the way through 2021, right? So wear your mask, wash your hands, distance, and be smart and be careful. Well, whew, so cheers. Here's to another spooky Sunday, and here's to all of you and all of us. We're all in this together. Cheers. So, last week I talked a little bit about, I told of an incident that happened to me in my house, and I said that I did not feel that the spirits that were there intended to harm me at all. And then I mentioned that they weren't dangerous, they weren't harmful. And then I just sort of on an aside mentioned that maybe not for me, but for my father, that was a completely different story. So I'm going to tell you tonight a little bit about some of the things that happened to and with my father in the house where I grew up. My father was very, very much Catholic, so much so that as a young man, he went to seminary. He was going to be a priest. And then he met my mother, and plans changed when they met one another. Let me move this out of the way so I could, there we go, get the things out. Anyway, so they lived together. They didn't live together. They got married, and then they lived together, and they immediately started having children. My older sister was born, and 11 months later, my brother was born, and then a year later, I was born, and at that time, they lived in this little apartment. And so my great-grandmother lived in the house where I spent my childhood, and it was her house that was gifted to her by her mother as a wedding present. And when we moved in, I was the fourth generation of my family to live in that house. And there was another family that lived there prior to my great-grandparents. The Davidsons was their name. Well, my father, being very, very Catholic, I mean, he was also Irish Catholic, so there was a lot of superstition. My grandmother and all my relatives all acknowledged the spirit world and ghosts and that sort of thing. But my father was... he was resistant, shall we say, but he was also extremely vulnerable because I think he had the abilities, but he denied that, and it scared him. It scared him a lot. So some of the things that happened, I remember my father was always very stressed out and nervous in the house. He just never seemed at ease. And my father was an anxious human the time I knew him. But it was very different there. When we would be out places and doing things, he would be fine. And we'd come back home, and it would be like you opened the door, and you know those pranks where they put a bucket of water over the door so that when you open the door, the water falls on you? Well, it was like when you opened the door, it wasn't a bucket of water that fell on you. It was a bucket of dark that fell over you. And it just didn't seem, it just didn't feel right. And he picked that stuff up. He had to be the the brave man protector kind of thing. My mother, when we were dealing with things, my mother heard some things and she saw things, but she really did not, she was not affected by it the same way as my father. This thing or things that were there seemed to target him. And at times when things were more stressful than other times, he was very susceptible to this sort of thing. I remember watching him and being very, very conscious of his behavior, because being a middle child, I was the middle child. At this time, they were two older than me, two younger, and I was in the middle. And the middle child always pays attention and knows the temperature of the pool before doing anything. And I paid very close attention and watched my father, watched my mother, watched everybody. And when there were times when you could tell something was starting to happen to him. For example, well, one of the things that he would do is, first of all, when he'd start to get really anxious, his knee would bounce up and down. And I'm not talking about just a little, tremor of the leg. I'm talking about boing, 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 boing. His knee would just bounce up and down and bounce up and down. And just this tense, fast bouncing up and down, up and down. And when that happened, it either meant that he was stressed out and we needed to be quiet, stop arguing, and move out of the room and leave him alone, or it meant something else was happening. And sometimes he would come home, and we would always meet him at the door. But at 5 o'clock, we would have to clean up the house and get things ready, and my mom would be making supper. We all had chores, and we had to have the house all picked up before my dad got home. And this was the 50s and early 60s. So when Dad got home, he would come in with his briefcase. He would take the train downtown and then walk a couple of blocks to our house. And he'd walk in and we would all run to him and say, "Daddy's home," and give him lots of hugs. And he'd pick us up and he'd do this on our head. He'd go bloop on the top of our heads. And I just loved that when he first came home. And then he would go in his room and get out of his suit, because he worked downtown, and by this time for the government, he worked as in the U.S. Attorney's office. And so he'd go and change his clothes. And while he would do that, before he would do that, when he would first come in, you could assess his mood when he came in. And my mother would always come and greet him and give him a kiss and all this stuff. And he came home after we would have dinner. So he would always have his dinner on a plate in his lap in the living room. And that came from when he was going to night school. He couldn't have dinner till like 9 o'clock at night when he got home from school. And he just kept that. He never was home at dinner time. We never all sat at the table together. It was all the kids at the table and my mother, hovering around or sitting on a chair next to the baby, feeding the baby and eating off of the baby's plate or something. But my dad always took his dinner after by himself in the living room. And when he would walk in, I would pay close attention to his mood. What kind of a night was it going to be, And usually when he'd come in, it would be okay. And then as the night would wear on, it would become more tense, just with him being there. I should probably back up. And before he worked for the government, when he was going to school, he was going to law school. He was working a full-time job and then going to Loyola Law School at night. And he had lots of studying that he had to do, and he had lots of reading and papers to write. And this is, of course, before computers, so he had like a stack of yellow legal pads and pens and stuff. And in our house, we had a living room and dining room with an archway between them and the kitchen. And then the hallway, there was a front hall and a long hall with the stairs that went upstairs. And at the end of that long hall, my parents had a bedroom downstairs. And upstairs, there was the big L-shaped room that we all slept in until we got a little older, and then Kate and I shared another room up there. But at the top of the stairs, there was a real small room. It didn't have a closet in it. It was just a small top of the stairs room. And my folks set that up as my dad's study. He kept all his books and all his stuff in there. And he never studied in that room, ever. He would keep his things in there. There was a desk, there was a chair, but he did not sit in that room and study. And this was not weird to any of us, because none of us would go in a room by ourselves. None of us would want to be upstairs in a quiet upstairs by ourselves. It wasn't going to be quiet. You were not going to be able to focus and study. And so what my parents did, I don't know if you remember those old oak barred playpens that they were wooden playpens, and the bottom was like a like fiberboard or something that flopped down so they could collapse, but the fiberboard could flop down, and then you'd put a little pad in there and the baby in there. Well, this playpen went in the middle of our living room, and the sides went up so that it was just resting on the floor. And in that playpen was placed a small card table and a folding chair. And my father climbed into that playpen every single night to study for his law school, and when it was time to study for his bar exam, for that. Right in the middle of everything. Right in the middle. Not even off in the dining room, away from the stuff. Right in the middle of the fray of, half a dozen 4 or 5 little children playing and running around, and all of the carrying on and bedlam that ensued with that. And he would just sit there and hyper-focus on his schoolwork. And it was in the playpen because that would keep us from getting into his things or going and touching his stuff, and the toddlers from reaching his papers and stuff. And he could step up out of there and go to the bathroom if he needed to, or to the kitchen. And it turned out that after time, he wasn't even keeping his books and papers upstairs anymore. He had a stack of books in the corner of the playpen, and he had the papers and everything. And his office actually was in this playpen in the middle of the living room. Yep, that's a true story. And he, not only did he finish law school, but he finished at the top of his class and blew everybody's mind, because he's had this family and he studied in the living room. I don't know if he told his professors that or anything, but that's what he did. And he did that because he hated being alone in that place. He could not, he would not be alone there. I remember when I was in, I guess, 3rd grade, because it was my first communion year. And, no, it wasn't that year. I don't know what grade I was in. I don't know what grade I was in. It wasn't that year. But there was a year when my brother Tom was born, and he was born in July. And now we would always go up north. I to Wisconsin for a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, to stay with my grandparents. My folks would come up, and we'd all go up north. But this year, my mother was about to give birth to a baby. We didn't know who it was at the time. And so my gramps came down and drove us all up north and left my mom and dad at home by themselves, so that we didn't have to worry about childcare while my mother was in the hospital. In those days, you would go in the hospital and have a baby. They would drag it out of you, and then you'd be in the hospital for a week, 5 to 7 days. My mother always opted for 7 because it was a rest for her. So while we were all up north and she was getting ready to have this baby, she prepared all these meals for my father and put them in little tinfoil packets. So she took put a piece of tape on and marked what they all were, and she had on one of his legal pads, she wrote down what each meal was and how to heat it up, how to prepare it, because my father was absolutely clueless in the kitchen. The joke was he could burn water, because he did once. He put on a pot of water and forgot about it, and it fried the pan. So, but she prepared all his meals so that all he would have to do is open up the fridge and pull out a packet, look at the directions, and heat it up in the oven. Or if it was she also made cold meals and stuff for him, so he didn't have to, she was taking care of her family, even though she was going to be in the hospital. So the time came for them to go to the hospital. She was going to have the baby, and they were there all day, as you could imagine. And my mother stayed, and my father had to come home. Now, my father hated the hospital. My father always hated the hospital. He grew up with the hearing from his mother and his grandmother that the hospital is where people go to die. And in fact, that was true, in the last century. But it wasn't necessarily true if you were going to the hospital to have a baby. But he hated the hospital. It just stressed him out so much. But my mother went into labor, and he gets her things, and he throws her in the car, or doesn't throw her in the car, helps her into the car, and off they go, and he waits and waits and waits. And it was, I guess, mid-morning or in the middle of the day when they left, and he was so freaking out about it, he didn't think to leave a porch light on or any lights on or anything in the house. And they went to the hospital, and my little brother was born. My dad, afterwards, my dad had to sit in those waiting rooms. They would make the father sit in the father's waiting room, and it would be filled with cigar smoke and as he described it, very annoying fathers to be, expectant fathers who wouldn't leave him alone. He always brought a stack of books, always, because remember there were 10 of us, and would put his nose in books as a signal to don't talk to me. I guess it was like putting your earbuds in today, but invariably someone would bother him, and he hated it. He just hated talking to strangers about things, and he did not like it. So after my little brother was born, he had to wait a little while so that they could pretty up my mother and put lipstick on her before my father was allowed in to see her and meet his new son. And then afterwards, he got in the car, and my great uncles, his uncles, had a pub, had a bar. And he decided that what he was going to do is stop at the pub on the way home and bring cigars and tell his uncles and everybody there, it was a neighborhood bar, everybody knew everybody, and tell him about having another son, because he already had 4 daughters and 1 son, and so this was his second son. So he was pretty stoked about that. And he named him Thomas More after the patron saint of lawyers. But so he drives to the pub, and they're all excited, and they're like, my Uncle Jack, hoy, hoy. They always said stuff like that. And what'd you get, another girl? And he says, no, it's a boy, it's Thomas More. And he passed out cigars, and they lined up shots for him and beers. And he sat at that bar till closing, drinking beer and whiskey. And when he got up to head home, his feet wobbled from under him, and he just, he was, pretty wasted. And so my Uncle Gerald told him that he shouldn't drive home, that he should have Jack drive his car home. Now, Uncle Jack was my father's uncle who lived right in the house next door with my grandmother. He was a bachelor uncle. And so Uncle Jack got up off his bar stool, and you can imagine Uncle Jack was not fully sober, but he was in a little bit better shape than my father. And the two of them stumbled off to the car, and my father sat in the passenger seat in the front and opened the window. It was a hot summer night, and Uncle Jack drove, talking the whole way, and my dad just kind of leaned on the window, and is the events of the day and the effects of the alcohol just kind of made him kind of drowsy, and he just kind of leaned on the window and let the cool breeze blow on his face and keep him from being queasy, and sort of dozed off when he realized the car had come to a stop. And our driveway was on one side, and then there was the house, and then there was Uncle Jack's driveway, and then Uncle Jack's house. So Uncle Jack pulled into our driveway, and he had to go across the house and across the other driveway to get to his house. And he tossed the keys on the seat to my dad, and he said, "Here you go, sleep, get to bed and sleep it off." And my dad was kind of collecting himself and pulling himself together, and he looked up at the house, and the car lights are off, and the street light is on behind, but every window is completely black. And this is when he realized he hadn't left any lights on. He also realized that he would have to walk into the house to get to a light switch. And he sat there looking up at the house, looking up at all the windows, and he just got this terrible sinking feeling. It just terrified him. And he thought, this is crazy. I could go in, I'm a grown man. I can go and turn a light on in my own house. I can go in my own house. And so he opened the car door, and he got out of the car, and he stood by the car, and he looked back up at those windows, and it was like, no, I'm not going in there tonight. He was still feeling really queasy and wobbly, and he thought, this is not a good idea. And so he got back in the passenger seat, closed the door, cracked the windows about this much, because as I said, it was a hot summer night, but if he left them open, he'd have been eaten alive by mosquitoes and things. And he slumped down in that seat looking at the house in front of him until he fell asleep. And he stayed there. So the next morning, he woke up when it was fully bright and hotter than hell in the car. It was just like steamy in the car. And he didn't know what time it was. And he just felt hungover, headache, and terrible. And he was like, oh, geez, I need to get in there. Now, I guess that was a Saturday or something. And next day was, I don't know, it doesn't matter, I suppose. But he got out of the car, and his back was sticking to the vinyl seat. You know, he was completely sweaty and stank. I mean, he smelled like old alcohol and cigars and sweaty body. And he said, I just need to go in and get cleaned up. So he grabbed the keys, got out of the car, closed the car doors, and went up into the front door. And he proceeded to turn lights on, because even in the daytime, when it's light, it always felt dark. One thing he noticed, though, he'd left windows open upstairs because it was summertime. The upstairs windows stayed open. And something that he noticed when he walked in was how cool the house felt. And he thought to himself that, they don't build old houses like this anymore, that, they stay cool in the summer and they stay drafty in the winter, but this house just seemed to stay cool all the time. It didn't ever get too hot. It always had a chill to it. So he appreciated that, and he went in the kitchen, and he just splashed some water on his face, and he was feeling like crap. So he opened up the fridge, and here are all these packs of things in the fridge, these tinfoil packs for my mom, and he wasn't hungry. He didn't want to eat anything. But also in there were cold beers, and he thought, hair of the dog. And so he popped open a beer and just let the cap just ding, 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 roll across the kitchen floor. And he just swagged down that beer, and as he did it, when he was standing there, he thought he heard somebody in the front room. And so he turned, thinking that maybe Jack had seen him go in and was like, where did you pass out in the car? And he was ready to tell him. If anybody asked that, he drank too much and passed out in the car, he was not going to tell anyone that he was afraid to go in his house. You could bet that. And so he thought it was Jack, and he stopped and he looked and he didn't hear anything. So he, had another long drink of cold beer. It felt really good going down. And he looked, he heard the steps again. So he said, Jack, is that you? My grandmother was not able. It couldn't have been her because she was handicapped by this time. She had arthritis really badly. And it wasn't Jack. And he thought, well, I don't know what I'm hearing. Maybe somebody outside in front or something. But he got that uh-oh feeling, And he's like, look, I need to go take a bath. I need to clean myself up because he had to go back to the hospital to see my mom that day. So he decided he was going to go up and run a bath and shave. And as he was up standing, he went upstairs and he just felt very uncomfortable. He held the railing and he walked, which he always told us to do. But he grabbed fresh clothes and went and climbed in, started running a bath while he went to the sink to shave. And I remember his shaving kit. He had one of those hair brushes, the brush, and he'd wet the brush and swish it around to lather up his face. And then he had a safety razor, that had the little blades that would go inside and click closed. And so I could picture him doing this. We used to watch him shave all the time, and all those whiskers would disappear. We'd rub his face before he'd shave, and then we'd rub it after. I remember that. So he was standing at the sink, and he was still queasy, and he had that beer up there with him, and he drank a little bit more of that beer, and as he was shaving, he thought he saw something move behind him, and he turned around to look, and nothing was there, and he got probably the same rush I get when there's something there, but he just got this anxiety. And so he decided he was not going to stand and look in the mirror anymore, because we grew up learning about denial very well. And instead, he was just going to get in the bath and shave in the bath. And he could just rough shave his face without looking in a mirror. It didn't have to be perfect. I guess it was Saturday. And so he got in the tub and shaved as quickly as he could. And when he got out, he had his clothes or something. I don't know if he was dressed. He was getting dressed. Something happened because he said that he ran out with his clothes. He felt like somebody was right behind him, and he turned around to look. And then he felt like something was behind him there, and he turned around that way, and he felt like something was playing with him. And he just went flying to go down those stairs. He did not hold the railing and walk, and he slipped and went boom, boom, boom on a couple of stairs. And he sat there on the stairs about halfway up, and he doesn't know why. He didn't know when he talked about this. He told me about this again not long before he passed, when I was there asking him for stories. This was one of the stories that I didn't know prior to him telling me this. He said he sat on the steps and just all of a sudden felt so sad and miserable that he just started to weep. He started to sob. And I only saw my father cry. Well, I saw him cry a couple of times. The first time I saw my father cry was when he heard that his mother was dying. And this was before that. He sat on the stairs and sobbed. He couldn't help himself. He was like holding his clothes wrapped in a towel, trying to get downstairs, and he couldn't move. He was completely, just fully engulfed in sadness. And he sobbed, and then all of a sudden, as quickly as it came, it just seemed to dissipate, and he was like, what the hell? And he got up, and he ran downstairs, and he put on his clothes, and he didn't get food. He left lights on. He did not he didn't do anything else. He just went right through the kitchen, right next door to my grandmother's house, and she had a pot of coffee on, and he got her coffee. And she, of course, told him, "You look like hell," because he'd been sobbing, and he'd been drinking all night the night before. And my grandmother was not all that fond of my mother. She called her that woman for most of her life because she stole my father away from her and the priesthood, and my grandmother blamed my mother for that. So she said something like, that woman's going to be the death of you. And he's like, Ma, I don't need to hear that. And she said, well, he said, I'm going back to the hospital to see Jackie. And so he went back to the hospital, and my mother was up wearing her new night dress or whatever, those house dress things, and looking all gorgeous and stuff. And my father, when he saw her, it was like, oh, when can you come home? He did not want to be by himself. And not only that, but he really missed her too. And she was like, you'll be fine. Everything will be fine. They won't let me go home, blah, blah, blah. And they got to spend a little time with Tommy and a little time with each other. And then in those days, you'd have like a couple of hours of visiting time, and then they'd kick you out to go home. And then you could come back again in the evening for a short visiting time. But it was a lot stricter. I mean, fathers had absolutely no rights. In those days, it was the nuns. They ran everything. And so this nun comes in, and she tells my father that it's time for him to go. And he's like, oh, I don't want to leave. And my mother said, it's okay, you go. I need to rest anyway. And he says, I'll come back tonight. I'll come back this evening. And she says, don't be silly. You have to drive all the way back here. It's Saturday. Just take it easy and listen to a ball game or something. And then I'll see you tomorrow. And on Sunday, the fathers or visitors could stay all day. You didn't have to leave after a couple hours. So that was going to be my dad's plan, to go and stay there all day Sunday. So he goes home, and his younger brother Jerry, and his wife Pat were at my grandma's house next door, and they had this burn barrel in the backyard, and they were listening to the ball game outside on the radio, and they were drinking beer, and my dad and his brother had a catch. They'd always throw a ball with each other. I can picture that in my mind's eye, just as clear as a bell. And they roasted hot dogs on the burn barrel. It wasn't garbage they were roasting them on, but and then Jerry and Pat had to get going, and it was evening, and my dad went in, and my grandma had a bunch of beers in her fridge because Jerry had brought a bunch, and he knew he had some in his house. And he went in and said goodnight to my grandma and grabbed another beer, and she said, don't drink too much, Davy. She's always nagging at him for this, that. And they had, in my grandma's backyard, she had this lawn chair, Chase Lounge, He said, I'm going to just stay outside for a little bit because I need to, the stars are all out, and I want to just sit out at the stars. And so she said, don't drink too much. So he lays in the lawn chair in the yard and drinks the beer and looks up at the stars. And he looks over at our house right next door, and the lights are all on. And he all of a sudden started feeling really hungry, and he thought of all those packets that were in that the fridge. So he went in, and he needed to clean up again because they were playing ball and stuff. So he picked out a packet of something to eat, found the directions, and he lit the oven. And in those days, you had to light a match and light the pilot light, and the oven would go whoosh. And so he turned on the oven to heat up the oven, and he put the packet of food on the kitchen table and popped another beer. He's probably had about 40 beers this weekend by this time, would be my guess. And he's going upstairs to get washed up and clean up and maybe get in another bath or something. And he goes up the stairs. And he also had left he having been a priest, having studied to be a priest, and he did his first vows actually. He had vowed to say these series of prayers every day, and he had that prayer book with him his entire life in his rosary, and he would do those prayers every single day. And in his hurry to in his hurry to go to the hospital, he had left his prayer book next to the couch in the living room. So he decided he was going to get his, first of all, get cleaned up and then get his prayer book. And as he walked into now it's dark by this time, as he walked from the kitchen into the dining room, he got this immense foreboding rush in his body. And he says it felt like somebody came from the front of the house running full speed ahead and pushing him backwards by his chest, so that he reeled backwards without his prayer book. And he was like, whoa, 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 whoa. And he just all the way back into the kitchen. And that was it. He wasn't going back in that house. So he went back outside and decided he was just going to sleep in that Chase lounge in the yard. He wasn't going to sleep in the house that night. And so he got in the chair. Fortunately, it was a warm night. And he put it under the cherry tree so that he wouldn't get covered with dew in the morning. And he went back in the side door of his mother's house. And she was sitting up, probably watching the late news with Fahey Flynn or something. And she heard him come in, and she said, "Davy, is that you?" And he says, "Yeah, Ma, I'm just grabbing something." She said, "You've already had enough to drink. Don't drink anymore." He said, "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm going to just sit outside for a little while. Don't worry about it." And he wanted to say, "Hey, can I just sleep on the couch here?" But what was he going to say? He was a grown man with a family, and his mother already thought he'd made a mistake. And what's he going to say? "I'm afraid to sleep in my house by myself. So can I sleep on your couch, Mom?" But he didn't. He had to be a man. And so instead, he grabbed another couple of beers, and he went and tried to get comfortable in that yard chair, that lawn chair. I remember it had these really scratchy strips, the woven strips, and it was green and faded white, like grayish and green. And he slept there. He stayed there all night. And the next morning was Sunday, and he knew that people would be walking by. Down around the corner was St. John's, the Lutheran church, and other people would always walk to church. And he was in the backyard, but the alley went through, and he did not want anybody to see him sleeping in the backyard by himself. He didn't want his mother to get up and look out the window and see him out there, because she'd be all over him for passing out. And so he was like, "Oh, Jesus," and he got up and, unstiffed his body and went back over to the house. He picked up the beer bottles that were on the ground there so that they weren't lying around. And when he went up on the back porch, and when he opened that kitchen door, he was hit with a blast of heat. It was like just poof, like opening an oven door. And he realized that he had run out and left that oven on all night long. And that foil packet that had, I don't know, hamburger and onions or something in it had melted, and the juice was just spilled out all over the table and on the floor. It was this ungodly mess. And he was like, "Oh my God." And he thought, I could have burned the house down leaving that oven on all night. And he could have. So he opened the back door and got one of those fans. We didn't have an exhaust fan yet. One of those, fans. And tried to get it to reach in the window, but he couldn't reach it, so it plugged in. So he aimed it towards the back door and propped the back door open to try to blow some of the heat out, turned off the oven. And again, he went upstairs and tried to get ready. Only this time, he knew he was not staying in that house, because once again, he just felt that horrible, ominous feeling. So he got his clothes, he got his dress shirts and his suits and his ties. He pulled all his clothes together, and he put them out on the back porch. He left. He got his shaving stuff and put it by the kitchen sink. He was not going in past the kitchen sink. He grabbed his prayer book and his rosary off of the end table in the living room. And he did this all so fast. And he got dressed for church. And he washed his face and he washed his pits. He did not take a bath. He just got himself ready as best he could because he had to take his mother to church. And then after church, he was gonna go back to the hospital. So he cleaned up the mess, took all that stuff that night, or that morning, yeah. And he put all his stuff, he hung it on the back porch. And what he was going to do is he was going to bring in the lawn chair. He grabbed some bedding, a blanket, and a pillow, and he was going to make that lawn chair into a bed on the back porch. Now, that back porch never felt scary at all. And as it turned out, the back porch was added to the house in like I think the 30s or the 40s, because a big, huge tree fell on it and took it down, crashed through the roof and destroyed the porch. And so his great uncles had built this new back porch. So that back porch was not part of the original house. And for some reason, that back porch did not feel scary. It had windows all around that had screens, but the windows didn't go up and down. They opened sideways, and so he opened all the windows and he set himself up there with his clothes for the week, and he was not going upstairs for that entire week. He was not going back in that house. He was going to stay outside. He was going to go to the kitchen long enough to heat up a packet of food, long enough to quick wash those dishes or eat it right out of the foil so he didn't even have dishes, and then get back outside and eat outside and sleep outside. And that's what he did. And he had that all set up, and he went and took my grandma to church. And then my grandma still, hassling him about all of his drinking and having to go and see his wife. And when he came home that night, every light in the house was on, and he didn't go in there. He stayed on that porch that entire week. That thing would grab a hold of him by, I think, here, because I think that whatever was there would enter my father and would use his body, and would express itself through him early on. I remember one time when he nearly killed us all. I don't know how old I was, but we had a baby and a bunch of us sitting in the living room, and it was a good day. Nobody was arguing, nothing bad was happening. He hadn't been drinking, and he was sitting there, and my father would always sit and read. He'd have a couple of books with him, and he'd read different books. He was always reading more than one at one time. Voracious reader, and he remembered them all. He probably read tens of thousands of books in his life, and they all stayed in his big brain. But I remember how this thing would, get to him. And I've told you the story about when I could feel it, and it was like it was tasting me, that when the lights went out and I was in the kitchen, and how, you could sense it being there. Well, I was always paying attention because things would happen in that house all the time that you could not predict. It was so chaotic. It was so unpredictable that it made it very stressful. And so I paid close attention to things. And I think that's probably one of the reasons I'm still so sensitive, because I would pay attention to the energy and the air in the room. And it would start with, first of all, there would be a change in the room. If it had a sound, it would be like that. And the air would, I don't know if it would get denser, but the air pressure would change. It would just, I think it got denser maybe, I don't know, but you could feel it. And then I'd get that rush and this tingly thing, and it would, I don't think it really got colder, but it felt like the warmth was being sucked out, like something was pulling the warmth out of you. And we, so I was sitting there. I gotta move this. I use that for time. And I felt this change happen. And my father was sitting on the couch with his feet up on the coffee table, shorts on, reading a book. And all of a sudden, I saw it start to happen. The first thing is he put his one leg down off of the coffee table. And he's still got his face in the book. And his knee starts to shake. His knee just starts to shake. And his breathing becomes shallow. So he's going... And I didn't know what was making him mad at first. I thought it was something was making him mad. But it wasn't. Because nobody was arguing. It wasn't loud. Kids were just, baby on the floor eating a soggy cracker, and we were just quietly playing around the room. And my mom was in the kitchen, and he's breathing shallow. And then what he would do is his face, it was like everything would get tense and his face would get really red. So red that it was almost purple red. And he would lower his chin toward his chest. And he would start to, like this growl, he'd go, like this. And that was a sign, get up, get out. And I stood up and I was kind of near to him and I backed up. And all of a sudden, he's holding the book and he starts gripping the book. And I thought he was going to tear the book apart. And he's looking down at it, but he's not reading it. He's just gripping this book so tight. And he looks up at us and I'm backing up and he looks right at me and he says, get out now, get out. And I'm like, mommy. And he's like, get out now. And we're like, where do we go? My mom is in the kitchen. Do we run to her? Or my mother comes out of the kitchen and she's got like a dish towel in her hand and she sees him as he starts to stand up. And there was this big, heavy lamp on the end table next to him. And he stands up and he's, get out. And then he's just like growl again. And then he picks up that lamp and starts raising it over his head. And my mother said, get out, run next door to Grandma's, go get Jack. Now Jack, remember, lived next door. And we're like, that was the general spoke. We just beelined it out that front door and ran, and he started coming after us with that lamp. But he said these big lumbering steps, like boom, boom. And I know that he was going to bash our heads in if he caught us. So we grabbed, somebody grabbed the baby and we're like running next door screaming, Jack, Daddy's gone crazy, Jack. This happened frequently. Uncle Jack was a railroad cop and he was often our savior. So everybody just runs out and runs to Grandma's house next door. And I didn't. I ran out and I got in the driveway. I went down the stairs and I turned and I looked back as my father came through that front door. And as soon as he got to the top of the porch stair, he stopped in his tracks and his face went white. His color changed and his eyes looked like his again. And he just loosened his hand and the lamp just went crash and crashed on the front porch, just smashed into a million pieces. And he was standing there and then he started to shake and he sat down on the step. Meanwhile, Uncle Jack comes running past me and he says, get in the house, get to your grandmother. And I didn't listen. I was that child. And he ran past me as my mother was standing in the doorway behind him. And my father sat down on that top step and he started to just head in hands. And he was like, Jesus Christ, what's wrong with me? What am I doing? What's wrong with me? And my Uncle Jack came up and sat next to him. And these men did not show each other affection. They would slap each other on the back. They always shook hands. They would do a, shoulder punch. That was their entire physical contact. And my Uncle Jack sat down on the step. My mother was standing behind with just wringing the dish rag, like looking like just terrified. And at a loss for what to do. My poor mother. And I was standing there in the driveway watching all this, and Uncle Jack sits down next to my father and puts his arm around him and pulls him to him so that my father put his head on Uncle Jack's shoulder. And my mother went and sat down on the other side of him, and she put her arms around him too. And they had him between the two of them. And we went, and I watched this, and I realized, and my father looked up and saw me watching, and he looked he said, I'm so sorry. And I felt like I knew I was witnessing something I shouldn't, but what I saw was his shame, and I didn't want to see it. And I said, it's okay, Daddy, it's okay. And my mother just flicked her hand like that. And so I went into my grandma's house where all the children were talking about how Daddy went crazy and was going to brain us all with the lamp. And Grandma told us to all go get a cookie. That's how my family dealt with. But my dad didn't come home that night. And when we went back over, we stayed at my grandma's a while. When we went back over, my mom came over and got us. And Jack was gone and my dad was gone. They probably went to the pub. But he didn't come home that night. He must have stayed at my grandma's. And my mom, just told us, Daddy just needs to get a good night's sleep. And I thought to myself, don't we all need to get a good night's sleep? So that was a couple of the big things that happened with my father. There were some others that were even more disturbing that I'm not going to get into tonight because I don't want to. Those were really difficult things, your parent that is there to protect you and keep you safe is absolutely helpless in the grips of whatever was in that place where we lived. It disturbed his sleep. It disturbed his waking. It focused on him. And that's when my father started drinking and then lost his ability to control that until much later in his life, and then again. But it was one of his demons that stayed with him. He got away from whatever it was in the house. Something did not like him there. Did not like him at all. So once we moved, of course, he was free of all of that. Nothing followed him, well, except the alcohol. But we were able to talk about it, and he was able to talk about it as an old man. And he said that he didn't remember many of those things, but he remembered my mother telling him. So something was going on. And in those days, what do you do? What do you do? Now, there's stuff that I would know what to do, but then I was a little kid. I didn't know what to do, and I wasn't able to help until now. And although I wasn't able to help him or us through that, I have been able to help those spirits in that house, I believe, I think. So that's one of the reasons I do what I do. Anyway, we all have our childhood traumas. Some are not just physical trauma. Some are psychic. It's when I learned to protect myself and my spirit, and never, ever let something get into me. no flipping way. There is, I had that almost happen once, and it pissed me off, and I pushed that sucker out, and I said, dude, I'm making you leave right now if you come back and try that again. I think I told you about that story. But, yeah, I will not let anything take over like that. I know when it's there, and I know instead of pulling in this, I push out. And I stand formidable because I control this body and I control this energy around it and this soul or spirit that it houses. So that's my story. I'm sticking with it. I miss my father. I miss my mother. He was able to talk about that stuff, which was pretty amazing. Tell me those stories. As an old man, tell me more stories too. It was great. I miss that. But first we're here, right? Then we're everywhere. So have a good week. Next Saturday is Samhain. It is a blue moon, a full moon, and it is going to be a powerful night. Take some time, after you do your Halloween party, take some time to be in that moon. Even if it's cloudy and rainy and you can't see that moon, it is there, and it can pull on you. And Halloween or Samhain is New Year's Eve in the ancient times. It was the beginning of the new year, the end of the growing season and the beginning of the new year. And the ancients thought that, believed that the year would end at sunset and the new year would begin at sunrise. And so that time between sunset and sunrise was between years. And that was a time where the spirits of the dead could come and walk because it was a time without time. So it was an unassigned time. And so they believed that the spirits of the dead could come back. And that's why they would put out carved, these are the Celts, carved turnips or things with a candle in it, so that if a spirit was walking by and looked in the window, it would look like it was already occupied by a spirit, and they would keep going down the road and not stop. And people would also put out special treats that their loved ones enjoyed before they passed outside of the house, because if you didn't leave a little something outside of the house, they might come in looking for it and might decide to stay, and you love your dead relatives, but you did not want them to stay. And it's amazing that those dead ancestors would come every time, because in the morning all the sweets and food would be gone. Whether or not the ancestors got it or someone else, or I think the village dogs and the poor folk had a delightful night. And that's the origin of Halloween and trick-or-treating. And so it's a new year. We've been through a really rough time. There's more ahead. Remember that the new year happened, and then the darkest of winter, the darkness would just fall until solstice, when the light would return. It's going to get darker, but don't be afraid of the dark. Sometimes it's in the dark that we can see most clear. Take care of yourself. Nourish yourself. Nurture yourself. Be kind. Forgive yourself. Our legs are all shaken. We're all under a lot of stress. Sometimes we growl. Have a good week. And I will probably see you next Sunday. Good night. Take care.